In the last video, we talked about how to find a paper, how to use sources like Google Scholar and PubMed, and what the different types of papers you'll find on those resources are like, what the difference is between a primary research paper as opposed to a review paper. Now that you have the paper in front of you, let's talk about how we read and analyze that scientific literature. And for this, you're going to think about questions like, what prior work formed the basis for this paper? What methods did the authors use? Is the data convincing? Were the data analyzed and interpreted fairly? What are the major conclusions, and what literature do the authors cite? And reading and analyzing scientific literature is so important no matter what specific discipline you are involved in, because literature is how scientists communicate with each other. We do experiments in our own little sphere here, our own little lab, and maybe other people at our institution or our friends might know about the work we're doing. But the way that the world finds out about the work that we do is when we as scientists write that in the form of a paper and we publish it, and then everyone reads it. And the beauty of scientific literature is that it forms the basis for a dialogue. So it's not just that you publish the paper and then it's over, but instead, scientists around the world will read that paper and analyze it and ask questions like we're going to ask today. And that analysis can help form the basis of this dialogue. So once you dive into a field and the more papers you read, the better idea you'll get of the major questions that are occupying that field. So what is everyone curious about? What is everyone working on? What are the major gaps in knowledge still? So for this video, we're going to explain the process of reading a scientific paper, detail a note-taking strategy for reading, and how we work on the analysis aspect. So we're going to learn about summarizing, note-taking, and analysis. First, I want you to take a minute and think about how you read a scientific paper before this moment. What questions do you ask? What order do you read the paper in? What are you looking for? So pause the video and write down for a few minutes what you've done in the past for reading. Okay, now that you're back, let's keep going. When you read a scientific paper, the major idea is that you want to constantly ask yourself questions. Reading shouldn't be a passive process, but instead should be an active, engaged process where you are asking yourself, what's happening? What's the purpose? Is this the best way to go about it? All through the paper. And there are different types of questions you want to ask yourself as you move through different types or different sections in the paper. So first, you're going to look at the title and the abstract. So I have a paper example here that I've been reading up. So you're going to look at the title, and then you're going to look at the abstract. So in this paper, the abstract is on the next page, the abstract. Can you determine from the title and the abstract what the study is about? You want to get a general idea of the research question and how they did a study to answer that question or to test that question. So what is the study about? What did they do? And then can you determine an outline of the results? What did they find? And finally, why are these findings important? And so when you set out to read the paper, you want to start with the title and the abstract, and once you read through that and get a general idea of the paper, you can then determine if you want to spend your time reading through the whole thing. Okay, so you start with the title and the abstract, and that gives you a flavor for what's involved. But you want to see if you can come up with a summary rather, of what the study is about. Then you're going to read the introduction. Okay, what is the general topic of the paper? What is already known about that specific topic? Why was that study undertaken? What was unknown, or what are questions the author's trying to answer? This is called the knowledge gap, or the gap in knowledge. And this is super important. So can you identify what gap they were trying to fill? And why is it important to address this gap in knowledge? What's the big deal? Okay, what is the research question or the research goal? Did the authors propose any sort of hypotheses or predictions? And as you read through, if you see specialist terminology, if you see jargon, you want to define them before you keep reading. So I generally highlight those jargon words and will then define them. Now, the introduction is a great place to start if you are new to the field. So if this is one of the first articles you're reading about a specific topic, you want to start with that introduction because they're going to kind of lay out the framework for the paper, and they're going to guide you. A well-written introduction will guide you through what you need to know before you get to the results. Now, if you've been reading papers about this topic for a long time, so for me, the field of Alzheimer's research, I've been reading those papers for a while. So in those cases, you might skip the introduction or come back to the introduction. But generally, for most students especially, start with the introduction. Make sure you fully understand the topic, the knowledge gap, their research question, and any hypotheses. Then you move to the methods, and you want to see what their general approach was. What did they do? What specific methods were used, and are you familiar with those methods? And if you're not, a great place to go is actually Wikipedia. So when you read through and you come across a method that you've never encountered before, go to either Wikipedia or even YouTube and try to learn a little bit more about that method and see, can you understand based on other methods that you are familiar with what's happening and what they're doing? What data were collected? How were the data analyzed? This is where they'll go into some statistical analysis parts. So you want to make sure you understand the statistics that were involved. And you want to try and draw out their experimental design or process. Can you make a timeline? Can you make a flow of treatments for groups? Can you identify the independent and the dependent variable for each of their specific experiments? Then you're going to go to the results, and you want to start with the tables and the figures before you get to the text of the results, and see if you can ask specific questions about the data. What is the subject of that figure or table? Does the figure show a pattern or trend that you can see with your eye before you even read about it? What's the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable? Does it look like there's a big difference between groups? If so, how big are those differences? Does it look like they're statistically significant? Then, once you've summarized the tables and the figures, you then read the written results. Do the authors explain each table and figure clearly? And what were the major findings for each experiment, and how does that fit into their overall hypothesis and the overall goal of their research study? Finally, in the discussion, you want to ask things like, what were the main results, and are the conclusions supported by the data? What do the results mean? Were the hypotheses and predictions supported that they originally made? What assumptions do the authors make? Might these be wrong? Are they testable? How could you test them? Do the authors generalize far beyond the populations or species studied? You see this a lot in work with model organisms, where they'll have findings in C. elegans, for example, and then in their discussion section, they'll start jumping all the way to humans. Well, is that warranted? Did they make the case that you could jump from C. elegans right to humans, or do you need more incremental work in between? What was the author's most important conclusion, and what questions remain unanswered by the study? What new questions did the study develop? What questions do you still have? As you read, you want to take notes, and you want to develop a good note-taking technique that helps you identify the important information, analyze the author's conclusions, digest difficult content, and then find desired information later. And importantly, avoid unintentional plagiarism. So these are very personal note-taking methodology. So you want to use what you're comfortable with. I am a Luddite. What that means is I hate technology sometimes, which is weird, as this is a video I'm currently making. But what I like to do is I like to write on the paper itself. So I will cover the margins with the important points. I will circle any references that they make to papers that I want to then read. I will put in highlighter words I don't know or techniques I'm unfamiliar with that I then need to look up. After I take notes, I then like to take notes on the paper. I then like to take notes in a notebook and put all of my notes together. And then at the very end, the last thing I do is I transcribe my notes and I type them out onto a Word document, and I'll organize it with different headings so that I can search for it later. Okay, after you take your notes, you want to then summarize the paper. You want to go through the whole paper again and write up the main points for each section using the questions as a guide. So this is the summary part. What did the paper show? Next, you need to analyze the paper. and you ask yourself a different set of questions. So the point of summary is to understand what happened. And the point of analysis is to take that a step further. So for the introduction, you want to ask yourself, did the authors make a strong case for why this is important? Was it clearly presented? Did they misrepresent previous research? This might be where you have to go and actually check and read the references. Does the research question follow logically from what we already know? I.e., is this an appropriate gap in knowledge? Do these make sense? Is the hypothesis testable? So again, in that summary part, in the first thing you do, you're just saying what the introduction says. In the analysis, you want to ask more detailed and further thinking questions. Is the introduction set up appropriately? Is the hypothesis appropriate, etc.? For the methods, you want to make sure that the studies are designed to test the appropriate hypothesis. Was the model system correct? Was the sample size sufficient? Do the experiments have appropriate controls? This is always something that I look for. I want to see a negative control, and I want to try and see if there was a possible positive control. There isn't always, but is it possible? Could I think of one? Did they use it? Then you want to look at the results. Do the results support or refute the hypothesis? Did they use the correct statistics? Do the figures and tables match the written description of the data? And as you look at all the figures, try to figure out what's the key figure? What's the figure that displays the most important findings of the paper? With the discussion, you want to look at significance. You want to see if you agree with the author's interpretation of the data. Did they overstate their results? Did they get something wrong? What are the limitations of their research? And do the authors actually address those limitations? And if the limitations weren't addressed, how might they impact the author's conclusions? Overall, you want to see if you could find anything that would be a fatal flaw. So did they miss something that makes their whole experiment, their whole paper, just null and void? Okay, did they maybe not use a control at all? Or they didn't test what they think they were testing? Or do you find just smaller issues that when added together decrease the quality of the study? Hopefully not, but sometimes this does happen. There are bad papers out there. Okay, now that you have learned about summarizing and analyzing, your assignment is going to be to read a scientific paper on Canvas and then submit a summary and an analysis. And for this one, I'm not going to grade you on how good your summary or analysis is. It's your first time. I just want to see the effort that you put into it. And you can also write any questions that you have about the paper at the end of your summary and analysis. And we're going to discuss this paper as a class in class 4. So see Canvas for those details.